Greetings and welcome back to Haftarot, the weekly video cast in which we take a look at the upcoming week's Haftara, try to understand its inner message, and how it relates to the Kriyat HaTorah that it follows on Shabbat morning. My name is Yitzchak Etshalom, and I'm delighted to be studying Haftarat Balak with you this week. Have to remember that Parashat Balak, which really is Parashat Bilam, is the story of Bilam, contains some of the most beautiful poetry anywhere in Tanakh, and some of the most effusive praise of Am Yisrael, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and of their relationship that we find anywhere. Sometimes it takes an outsider to recognize and appreciate who we are. So before taking a look at the Haftarah itself, we're going to take a look at a passage which would seem to be unrelated. It's a passage, parts of which are very familiar to everyone, but the rest of them are not as familiar. Towards the end of Masachet Makot, the Gemara records a drasha of a particular Rabbi Samlai, who is a fourth generation Palestinian Amorah, meaning he lived in the 4th century, the end of the 4th century, and he gave the following drasha. Darash Rabbi Samlai, Moshe. Moshe was given 613 mitzvot. Nothing new, but this is the source, this is where you get it from. 365 mitzvot lo ta'aseh, to correspond, a way to remember it as easily is the solar year. And 248 mitzvot aseh, they correspond to what in their early understanding of anatomy was the amount of limbs in a person's body. The Gemara then goes on to give some textual support to the idea of the number, and the gematria of Torah, which Moshe gave us, is 611, and 2 of them we heard directly from God. Right. The Gemara then goes on and says, and continues very similar, Rabbi David Vavidan alachatisrei. David then summed them all up, compacted them into 11 statements. And those are the 11 statements in Psalm 15 and Tehillim Tedvav that talk about a righteous man, a good man that is honest, that never cheats anybody, etc. And then by Yeshayahu v'midan al sheish, referred to reference by Yeshayahu, Bam Micha v'midan al shalosh. Micha came along, and Micha, by the way, was after Yeshayahu. So far we're going in chronological order, and put them into 3. And what are the 3? Dichtiv, has man, have you been told what is good and what Hashem wants from you? It's nothing but kim asot mishpat ve'avat chesed v'asnei alechet im Hashem elaracha. It is doing justice and loving kindness and walking humbly, however we're going to understand tzniut, with Hashem. And now the Gemara does this in all cases, but because that's our last pasuk in our Haftara, I wanted to share also the explanation of that phrase in the Gemara. Asot mishpat, what's that? Zehadin, that's justice. Avad chesed, zegmilut chasadim, doing acts of kindness. What's hatsnei alechet? It's a wild explanation. Zeh hotza'at hamet v'achasat kala, doing the ultimate kindness for people, helping a young couple get married, taking care of somebody at their final burial. And then the Gemara goes on and says, Chazar Yeshayahu v'midan al shtayim. So Yeshayahu now comes back and turns it into 2 principles. And then Chavakuk, who's about 100 years later or so, v'midan al achat, and that's tzaddik be'emunato yichya. So what Chazal are suggesting in this passage is that the 613 mitzvot are not only a series and a group, a large group of commands of how we are to live our life, things to do, things to avoid, responses to certain situations, but rather they reflect a particular value system, a series of priorities, ideals that we should internalize and make part of who we are, and that later Nevi'im took that whole picture and contracted them into smaller, simple statements. Not that they would replace the mitzvot, God forbid, but that this was the goal of the whole thing, and that the 3 things mentioned by Micha in our Haftara are 3 of them, are a way of summarizing the entire picture into 3. By the way, Chazal continue in this style when we have the statements al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, the world stands on 3 things, that there are mitzvot that in she'adam ochel perotei ba'olam hazeh v'keren k'olam haba, or sheneged kulam. These they are equal in value to all the others. These are value statements about mitzvot. The Haftara from Micha speaks about how Am Yisrael will one day be great, Micha is speaking at a time where things are not great and where the Assyrian threat is knocking on the door of Israel, and Yehuda is not far behind. But if we take a look at the connection to the Haftara, you take a look at Pasuk Aleph, the beginning of chapter 6. Shimuna et asher Adonai omer, kum riva ta'arim v'tishmana hagvaot kolecha. So, Navi, you get up and you challenge the mountains. Let's hear what happens. Shimu arim et riva Adonai. God is taking you to court. God is suing you. Vaitani mostear, it's the strong pillars of the land. Why? God is challenging his people. And let's see what the challenge is. What have I done to you? What have I hurt you? Please answer me. And this is almost like we saw 2 weeks ago when Shmuel gets up in front of the people and says, please tell me, what have I done wrong to you? This is now God saying it. Why would he say this? I brought you out of Mitzrayim. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. I gave you an entire family of great leaders, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. This is the connection of the Parsha. Don't you remember what Balak was conspiring against you? And how Balaam answered him? What did Balaam answer him? Whatever God says, that's what I'm going to do. I don't have a choice. I can't curse them. What was the point of all this thing? Why do you even know this story? You weren't there. It was up in the mountains. You don't know about it. So you should know all the great things that God has done for you. God has intervened to make sure that somebody who tried to curse you turned around and blessed you. And that's why this is the Haftara here. So the question is now, how do we respond? How do we come back to God? With a lot of korbanot, a common mistake made during the period of the Nevi'im, that always just bribe God, as it were. Does God want all of these rams, all of these oil, all this oil? Am I going to give him my firstborn son? No, you know what it is? You know what it is that God wants? Now you'll see our pasuk in context. What is it God wants? Essentially, God is saying, you know how you treat me well? You treat me well by treating each other well. You show gratitude and acknowledgement for the kindnesses that I've done for you by being kind to each other. Make sure that there is asot mishpat. There should be justice. And asot mishpat is almost always associated with making sure that the underprivileged, the disenfranchised, don't get hurt in court, don't get abused in court, as was a common problem in the 8th century BCE. Read Amos, Parak, Aleph, Bet, all the way through. And Ahavat Chesed, you shouldn't just do acts of kindness. You should love doing acts of kindness. It should be something that drives you, that you have a passion for, and measure that against, mitigate that with, walk humbly with God. Don't make your religion something that you hold up as a banner. So have it something that's close to you and internal, something that you prize its privacy. And so while you love kindness and you make sure to enact judgment, make sure that your religious life with God is something that's kept discreet and it's kept dignified. And that's the Haftara. And we now understand why this Haftara is such a powerful statement in response to the story of Bilam, because Bilam is looking at this magnificent nation. It'd be very easy for us to look and say, hey, look how magnificent we are. No, not so quick. Let's make sure that you're doing everything right. And that when you are doing it all right, you are doing it with dignity and with discretion, and not by waving a big flag, pounding your chest about how great you are. We should have a wonderful Shabbat and enjoy this beautiful Haftara from Micha Navi. Shabbat Shalom.